Hushed silence consumed the throngs of delegates, operatives, journalists, and bosses seated around Chicago Stadium, where attendees of the 1940 Democratic National Convention heard for the first time a message from the President of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt's message to the convention, dictated over the phone and delivered by Senator Alvin Barkley, refuted speculation that Roosevelt would seek a third term as president. It was an unreal moment. The air was sucked out of the room. There would be no deliverance, no hope for change, no booming voice from above, just an impending vote without the star choice. "I have an additional message from the president," said Barkley, who unfolded a secret sheet and braced over its contents. "President Roosevelt endorses, for the Democratic Party's nominee for president, Harry L. Hopkins of New York." Silence, muted, strained applause, snowballing into an unconvinced ovation. Liberals' 8-year reverie ended there. Their champion abdicated, backing on a sick standard bearer, awash in shattered morale. They expected a flood, and on November 5th, they saw one. Well, hello there, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. My name is Mr. Dogboat333, and welcome to a very special video. This is an overview of Development Diary number 30 for TNO mod Yippie, part 1 of 4. We might get to part 2 of 4, depending on how quickly we get through this. In this video, otherwise we'll probably get to it in a separate video. I've been making a lot of TNO-oriented videos for a very, very long time now. Since I think the first demo. But I've never covered a Development Diary up until now. However, just with the, how things are shaping up, I thought it would be interesting to hop in and go over the Development Diary personally. Read it out, go over some thoughts that I have as I go through it, and maybe figure out a little bit more about some of these characters, some of these new changes, and see what's coming up in TNO within, let's see, 20 years when this update finally comes out. I'm being slightly facetious, of course. Let's go ahead and hop into the patch background. Yippie. Welcome to the New Order, Yippie's Development Diary. This is Mangolith, Happy Warrior, and Quid Pro Quo, the America team leads, and today we'll be detailing the future of America's content and what it has to offer for TNO and players like you. So, I'm blinking on Happy War and Quid Pro Quo. If I'm correct, Mangolith is one of the main developers over on the W and Things That Never War team for the campaign trail mods. I believe he's in charge of, I think it's a he, I'm not sure. I don't pay too much attention to the developers, admittedly. Probably should pay more attention, but I believe they're working on Project 2024 as well, which is supposed to be dropping soon, 2024 mod. So Mango, I've played some of his work without even fully realizing it. At least, like, if this guy would be connected to this. With W, Things That Never War. I've had a lot of fun with both of those, so I'm already intrigued. We'll also get into the fact that they were in charge of adding Philip Hart, which just content-wise and story-wise is probably the best path for the United States. And there was a pretty noticeable gap between mechanic quality between, well, really a lot of them, but like Philip Hart, between some of these, there's a gap with Philip Hart, pretty big wide berth, and then maybe Wallace, LBJ, Bennett, RFK, and then another pretty big gap there, and then it's all the rest of the 68 candidates. There is a pretty noticeable gap in quality, so I think going in and reworking or adding content to potential candidates, I believe some are getting outright gutted. We'll get to the 64 candidates when we get there, but from my recollection, some have been moved around, some I didn't see at all. But we'll get there when we get there. Right now, we gotta go with the patch background. I'm meandering a little bit. Hope you guys don't mind. We'll get to it. The USA rework, Yippie, has been under development since late 2022. Its team started as a group of 3 who designed heart content to ensure we wouldn't hold up any other team's content needs, as we designed the largest rework of any TNO nation. This rework involves more than tripling the size of United States content and taking the first steps to place America within the boundary of TNO2, with content up until January of 1977. That's kind of massive, actually. And you know what else is massive? This patch began as an extension of Toolbox Theory 3's USA content, notably the addition of Philip Harper as a new 1968 presidential candidate. Fans quickly noticed the uptick in the quality of both gameplay and story compared to the other USA BAFs, once it got patched, of course, and it wasn't a buggy fucking mess, inspiring us to take things further. The biggest motivators for our undertaking with this rework are that the current USA content for TNO are a lack of continuity between presidencies, as in these, which presidents can undo a previous administration, a lack of changing body politics and cultural engagement, and a disconnect between what is happening in the world and what happens in the United States. I think these are all pretty big notes that should be addressed, and I think it's a good thing they are being addressed. I remember the old meta for Glenn, when you want to do the John Glenn path, was to just tank the country as George Wallace, or do RFK and then screw things up so you get Strom Thurmond, and then you get segregationist content, and then just within the span of a quick little reaction tree, you're supposed to somehow undo all of that. And that doesn't, it's fine enough for gameplay purposes, but if you could expand that into a way that's compelling and interesting, I think that's worthwhile. So I think that strikes me as a pretty solid way to check things out and a way to expand things. So in short, we want to emphasize a strong USA narrative, which places that country firmly in a Cold War hot seat and emphasizes dynamism, strong characters, and an in-depth engagement with American history. We understand that much of the community loves the current USA content, and we would not do something so brazen as rework these foundations if we were not absolutely confident in its replacement. Yeah, that's a big thing. I think that a lot of people are always going to be... People are apprehensive of change in general. Remember I saw when the content of the rework for the UK got officially implemented in, and I think the content in that update was objectively better, at least in its depth of what it went into. Now, scope-wise, it didn't cover nearly enough, so on that perspective, I do understand people getting a little irked, but I remember being people upset, like, well, we don't like that they got that removed. My thing was, I thought it was better, so I didn't mind it one bit, but I don't not understand that perspective. And I do think that keeping that in mind in the future is a good thing for TNO mods, the TNO developers. So I, for one, am curious to see how far this update is going to go. I have some beans I need to spill. I'm curious. I'm not sure when I'm going to spill these beans, but we'll get there when we get there. Whereas current TNO USA has 12 normal candidates, 2 edge cases, and playable content up until 1973, Yippie will bring 30 normal candidates, over 10 edge cases, and playable content climaxing for 1976 bicentennial and ending after January 20th, 1977. Yes, that's right, TNO 2 starts here. In this diary, we detail the lore of America and, more pertinent to gameplay, American content until the inauguration of the winner of the 1964 election. We'll cover those year's major events, the new mechanics, and the 5 potential presidents-elect for that year. While this diary will only cover the first 3 playable years of content, playable content from 1962 to 1977 is not a vague, illusory promise to a patch, but rather something already designed and currently being implemented. You can expect to get your hands on this patch next year. So that's actually not too bad at all. Is this going to be the next big patch for Tino? I'm not certain. I think the Tino devs said that they're going to be less ambiguous on, they're not just going to announce things and then without a serious timeline for them. So next year, I mean, on one hand, it is a year away. On the other hand, when you think back to Penelope's Web, all the European content, where he works to Canada, Manchuria, France, Turkey, all that content's been announced and it hasn't really come out. They even announced in a more update in the previous dev diary, and that hasn't been out however long. So I don't know what the status of that is, admittedly. Probably should have done a little bit more research before I hopped into that specific section of it. But I do like that they're putting a definite announcement on this. Time-wise, I think that's a good thing to keep people from getting too antsy. And assuming they're being honest, I do appreciate the transparency. Now, if it turns out to be a nonsensical claim, then so be it. I mean, it's a free mod. I can only get so irritated when none of these people are getting paid, at least to my knowledge. So I'm not going to be too in demand, but it has been a problem the Tino devs have had. So if this is a step to rectify that, I do appreciate that. Anyway, that's a lot of background nonsense. Not that any of this is nonsense. This is all interesting stuff to me. Maybe to you guys too. Hopefully to you guys too. So let's go ahead and hop to the lore. Editor's note, we suggest those interesting gameplay, but pay mind to the lore portion below. Though if not your speed, check out the link to part 2 here, which I believe, yep, that goes into the actual gameplay stuff. Now, we're going to be getting that definitely in a separate video. This video is only going to cover part 1 and maybe part 2. It's going to depend on how long this goes. I do have some stuff I have to get to, so I might have to break up into the full 4 parts. But we're going to be going through all of these. I'll upload these over the next couple days once I get them done. Happy 4th of July, by the way. Not expect how this is how I was going to be celebrating 4th of July, but let's get to it. Bright white waves of flashbulbs peppered the side of President Franklin Roosevelt's all-black carriage like sounds from a machine gun. So many hands to kill the champion of this court-packing scheme, and those same figures, Republicans and Democrats, all returned to glory. It was July 16th, 1937, hot and somber, and the first family sat behind trotting horses en route to the funeral of Senator Joseph Robinson of Arkansas. President Roosevelt stared out the window, not raising his hand to wave or his lips to smile. Perhaps First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt asked him, "Are you all right, Franklin?" To which the president may have said, "I simply worry about Mrs. Robinson," or another utterance of false confidence. Never mind that Senator Robinson had brought Roosevelt's agenda in the grave with him, or that there was impending recession. The failures after failures in Congress and bring world conflicts in Europe, Asia, and the Americas all weighed on his mind. Never mind the victories, Roosevelt only saw the defeats and would never recover from the spiral. After that July day, everything to him was sand, pouring, never to be held again. So this is interesting. I believe in real life, one of Franklin Roosevelt, one of the things he tried to do during his administration was pack the courts, because he was getting some pushback on his domestic agenda from the courts. That failed in our timeline, but the courts kind of came to a compromise. Okay, look, we'll keep our heads out of economic and legislative stuff, because that's going to be the purview of our government. Even if we're not major fans of it, for the most part, we'll just stay back as long as it's not blatantly unconstitutional. We'll start messing with it. It looks like, and that was kind of just a slap on the wrist. Nothing major actually came out of that. People were murmuring about it. They were worried about it. But nothing really manifested from it, at least on a major level from there. Looks like one of the big points of divergence in the Tino timeline is that is no longer the case. The march of Roosevelt's dominance in the U.S. dissipated with 38 midterms, where Republicans and conservative Democrats thrashed the Roosevelt coalition on a push for restraint in congressional government. Yep, there we go. The New Deal, Roosevelt's behemoth, restructured the American administrative state, but could neither prevent the recession of 37-38, nor provide accountability for the machines and cartels that drew paychecks from New Deal programs. In the eyes of conservatives and an increasing number of liberals, the once tolerable President Roosevelt was now a gangster tending to an administrative protection racket for the American economy. To beat this current and end the regulatory nightmare, Republicans sought an expert in throwing high-profile criminals into the light. While the Republicans courted a standard bearer for 1940, the Roosevelt White House remained in turmoil. President Roosevelt could have run for a third term, buckling up the precedent set by Washington, but his doubt remained constrained and intense. He'd seen close up President Wilson's undoing, how a vicious Republican Congress ravaged his life's work and cleared the way for today's Nazi regime. Seeing the consequences firsthand in 1920 and how this failure lingered with the party until Roosevelt's victory in 1932, he decided it was best not to attempt a disruption of his already unstable position. So this leads us up to Thomas E. Dewey. Started as District Attorney of Manhattan on New Year's Day, 1938, wide-eyed and ambitious for a shakeup against organized crime. Dewey, born in 1902, was approaching his 36th birthday and his 5th year prosecuting gangsters in New York City with a soaring public image. Newspapers hailed him almost unanimously, the population screaming his name in passing, and his gleam was such that thousands of voters, neighboring attorney general races, wanted to elect the young warrior for their community. Dewey was young, popular, and lacking deeply the credentials of an administrative leader, remarkably talented at carrying himself in a consistently flattering way. So, Thomas Dewey, you all might know him. He ran in 1944 against Roosevelt, lost pretty massively. Then he ran again in... I'm not going to make the low taper fade joke again. Ran again in 1948 against Harry Truman. Was expected to win, didn't. Was governor of New York after this. He was originally district attorney. I forget when he was elected. Thomas Dewey. Early 1940s. So it looks like he was elected in 42. So they're jumping the timeline a little bit for the prominence of Dewey. Though, the way they're explaining it lore-wise, I can see this panning out. It makes enough sense to me for them to push the timeline a little forward and get Dewey in. Or not. Yeah, Dewey. Beating out moderate Wilkie and heavily conservative Robert Taft by covering both bases, Dewey tore an energized RNC of new ideas and a return to reasonable government. By contrast, the Democratic convention seemed almost mournful as delegates nominated Roosevelt's Secretary of Commerce and political proxy, the sickly Harry Hopkins, for President of the United States. As the 1940 presidential election campaign evolved, Dewey's inexperience took a backseat to mass disruption of Hopkins' health and alleged improprieties. Deals to lend equipment to Democratic forces in war-torn Europe stalled, relations with Japan grew only more antagonistic, and increasingly the American people came to view the election of Dewey as a done deal. Dewey returned with a snappy isolationist quip for every interventionist appeal Roosevelt made, and fought the president on the economy, the administrative state, and foreign policy. In the end, there would be no crowning foreign policy achievement for the final act of President Roosevelt, nor victory for his chosen successor, leaving the crisis unfolding in Europe and Asia in the hands of 38-year-old President-elect Thomas Dewey. So this is the electoral GUI that we are looking at. There's some stuff over here which is going to pop up later on in the mechanics. We have Harry Hopkins. We have the candidates right here. So we have Harry Hopkins and Richard Russell for the Democratic ticket. Harry Hopkins in our timeline was Roosevelt's Secretary of Commerce. Big figure with stuff like Lend-Lease, New Deal programs. Sickly guy. Didn't die too much after Roosevelt did in real life. And then Richard Russell, a senator from Georgia, a previous governor, horrible segregationist, vicious segregationist. Helped organize the boycott at the 64 DNC. Big filibuster of civil rights legislation. Thomas Dewey we've been through already. Joseph Martin was the minority leader from Massachusetts or Maine? I have his Wikipedia page pulled up right now. Massachusetts. And Antino timeline becomes the next vice president. So I want to pop up to the GUI. We might be jumping the gun a little bit, but looking at it, we have these different buttons here, which haven't been quite pulled up. But we have the electoral map. You can tell this comes from a fucking TNO dev. The focus on this. So it has the national distribution spread out very well. Something I do want to point out, it also has Congress. It doesn't just say Senate, it has Congress. That makes, I believe that means that the House of Reps might be getting some official integration. I believe there's a submod that integrated the House of Reps into the TNO mod, but not so much officially. So that would be interesting. We also have the Supreme Court. Now, there was a vague little GUI that talked about the Supreme Court, you know, like the distribution of liberal and conservative judges. But, and I think this waits until gameplay, but they are officially adding the Supreme Court in a pretty major way. I'm gonna pull up the teaser that they did, and they announced. We're jumping the gun a little bit, but hey, what's the harm in jumping the gun a little bit? So the Supreme Court is going to be officially modeled in, as of now, including potential impeachment events. It's going to be very, very interesting to see how it plays out. Let's not get there yet. Also, I want to point out, DC, Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico appear on this map. This makes me think that these areas are going to get official representation. Now, DC, Hawaii, and Alaska, that's not too crazy. That happened on our timeline. Puerto Rico, though, that's going to be very interesting. Puerto Rico just kind of lives awkwardly in the corner of most Hearts of Iron 4 mods. So, even like a little inclusion there is going to be interesting to see. I also wonder what's going to happen if Puerto Rico can get independence like some people there want to in our timeline, or if it's just going to be fully integrated. That'll be interesting, though. But let's hop back into things. Upon his inauguration, it became abundantly clear to Dewey and his administration that their victory hadn't been enough to reshape America and its priorities abroad. While conservatives welcomed Dewey's restraint with presidential powers, the administration failed to build legislative support and delivered next to nothing from the party flank. This failure, paired with Secretary of State John Foster Dulles' influence over the young president, bungled foreign policy initiatives and decreased Dewey's authority significantly. Then, on December 7th, 1941, amid stalled talks on peace in the Pacific, Japanese naval aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii to devastating effect. The administration initially planned 42 to do or die, directing their attention to the WPA and Social Security, but the result of Roosevelt and Hull's prior failures to reach peace with the Empire of Japan would forever change the nation. Days later, the USA joined the United Nations alliance against the Tripartite Pact, marking yet another unfulfilled Dewey campaign promise. Perhaps President Roosevelt had sought an unprecedented third term in office, his leadership and command of the presidency would have jostled the American nation from slumber and really begun its push towards mobilization. The force of his personality, famous in years previous for pushing through his New Deal policies against incredible odds, would have reawoken and given the United States its chance at war that so many post-war commentators said Dewey lacked. Imagine Franklin Roosevelt leading a war. I cannot imagine that personally. This did not happen. President Dewey floundered and ascended to the loudest voices in the room, paralyzed by the weight of his task and the already insurmountable division of his presidential administration. Among the shipwrecks smoldering in Pearl Harbor was the USS Enterprise, the flagship of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which was later joined on the ocean floor by the USS Lexington, Hornet, and Yorktown, as Japan pushed further east. Soon, Japanese forces landed in Midway Atoll, directly threatening Hawaii and warranting a general focus on the Pacific over the European War. At the insistence of the joint boards and his advisors, President Dewey authorized General Douglas MacArthur to carry out an offensive in East Papua to seize the dusty East Indies and reinvade Manila as part of the Pacific First strategy, formulated after MacArthur's withdrawal from the Pacific Japanese-occupied Philippines. Almost immediately, this campaign bogged down and continued as a slow push westward for the rest of the war, creating over 100,000 American casualties in the process. In part due to the machinations of the anti-communist, anti-Atlanticist Robert Taft, the U.S. sent no aid to the Soviet Union against Germany and did little to prepare the U.K. against the March 1943 Axis invasion of Britain. Despite the northward retreat of the British theater's front line, rising media star General Dwight Eisenhower's defensive performance gave hope to an eventual turnabout, in sharp contrast to the perceived incompetence of a joint board at Dewey's foreign policy establishment. So we're seeing a pretty big divergence from our timeline and looking for ways to explain how the Germans could have won World War II. We have a much worse Pearl Harbor in our timeline. Dewey unable to push back against the other voices and create a clear vision for his foreign policy, and interference from the isolationists preventing aid going out to Britain and especially the Soviet Union. So it's also making enough sense within the context of the TNO world. Realistically, the Germans aren't winning World War II no matter what. But, you got to take some liberties. And I think these all make plenty of sense within the context. So let's go ahead and get back to this. The war presented a new opportunity for the administration to reshape the United States on the home front. According to the incumbent Republican establishment, World War II was not a war for democracy, as many Democrats advocated, but instead another rebalancing of world power akin to the First World War and other European wars before. Debate for the war justification now existed to slash government expenditure. New Deal programs starved, institutions were liquidated, state and federal hospitals closed, patients were sterilized and released or silently disappeared, and generally, funds returned to Dewey's wartime resource pool. Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. Despite these cuts, it wasn't until the 42 elections brought in a new Democratic majority that mobilization projects began in earnest. The oppositionalist Congress assumed an outsized role in directing the war effort. Organized labor made the Democratic constituency fought with the Dewey administration after it sanctioned government contracts, allowing speed-ups and lock-ins, spurring wildcat strikes, and even radical action against industries. Soon, Democratic unions were increasingly cooperative with the Communist Party of the United States and other socialist groups, rebuilding the Democrats' liberal syncretic Popular Front coalition and earning intense scrutiny by J. Edgar Hoover's G-Men. On the administration's direction, the Federal Bureau of Investigation targeted spies, subversive and ideological extremists, real and imagined, involved in the war effort. These include labor leaders, members of the top-secret Manhattan Project, nuclear program, and even Democratic state secretaries, all of whom faced harassment, raids, and periodic detainment. Due to the internment of Japanese Americans, German Americans, and Italian Americans in facilities across the interior United States. This policy of ethnic targeting, especially towards Japanese Americans, instilled a racialized paranoia in the American zeitgeist, which, exacerbated by wartime propaganda and campaign materials during the 1942 and 44 elections, did not subside during the post-war period. He made use of the FBI against war saboteurs, generally overreacting against perceived threats on American soil and in Latin America, contributing to a growing sentiment of wartime terror that further hindered mobilization. In this environment, Democrats nominated as their 44th president Justice William O. Douglas, pairing Roosevelt-era experience with a modern, unabashedly liberal approach to the presidency. His popularity, paired with the Southern backing from Vice President nominee Tom Connally, made him a shoo-in before Election Day. But a narrow margin, especially in Western states, Dewey won re-election. Despite disputes, protests, and general shock over Douglas's loss, American people never once change horses mid-race, accepted Dewey's victory as necessary for winning a fair peace. And yet, the war situation further deteriorated. So this is this is the 44 election, as it pops up in the GUI. Very, very narrow race, it looks like. I wonder if Dewey even won the popular vote here. So, it goes between William O. Douglas, who, the start of a TNO timeline, starts as the Chief Justice. He was just a major justice on the Supreme Court in our timeline, along with Tom Connally, senator from Texas. Probably a horrible racist as well. Let me pull up his Wikipedia page. It only talks about Truman Doctrine. Anti-lynching, never mind. Probably not a good guy. And then Dewey and Martin. Same old there. By 1944, the U.S. had turned around the naval situation in the Pacific and had begun a slow campaign of island hopping while prioritizing resources for General MacArthur's Papua campaign. As early as 1942, dissident voices within the Army and President Dewey's cabinet criticized MacArthur's approach but faced censorship from the higher-ups. Even as the general's star faded, his defenders in high places kept him afloat, much to the displeasure of the general enlisted and the American people. President Roosevelt's war kickstarting the development of a uranium-fueled bomb in 1940 faced great difficulty under the Dewey administration, as budgetary restrictions and inquiries into alleged espionage and political extremism saw many otherwise suitable personnel evicted from the project. One of the few exceptions, J. Robert Oppenheimer, correctly predicted the United States would not have a combat-ready nuclear weapon until 1946. American Marines retook Midway in 43 and occupied much of the British and French Pacific Islands by early 44, but this came at the expense of the collapse of the China-Burma theater and the 1944 withdrawal of a rapidly destabilizing British India from hostilities with the Japanese. Matters worsened with the death of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, whose replacement, Lord Beaverbrook, that cannot be a real name. I refuse to look that up. I choose to believe they made that up. Increasingly favored negotiated settlement with Germany. American deployment of chemical weapons and intense bombing campaigns against southern British cities further urged pro-peace sentiments among the British population, and by late 44, it was apparent that the UN would not reclaim Britain. Fearing a scenario where a pro-German British puppet government would repudiate the sizable war debts owed to the U.S., in March 45, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles authorized negotiations to meet German representatives in neutral Sweden to formulate terms for an armistice. A damning prediction by the War Department that the United States could defeat Japan by 1949 further sapped the war effort, and the surprising receptiveness of the Japanese to ceasefire brought Japanese agents to Sweden as well. From that point, it was a competition of deft diplomacy, with the United States leveraging its imminent peace with Germany against Japan, ultimately negotiating agreement along the lines of current occupation. In July of 1945, the United States formalized two armistices with the Axis powers, whose terms also applied to the remaining United Nations armies. Britain would honor its debts to the United States and its allies, and occupation areas would remain as they were on June 1st, 1945, until a further peace treaty could design the new order. Get it? Roll credits. Dulles saw correctly that both Germany and Japan were already severely overextended and could pose no immediate threat to the American sphere of influence, but compromising the popularity heralded notion of a war for democracy with pragmatic partition of the world incited uproar across the political spectrum. With one vile compact, the United States compromised against democracy, rejecting liberty and justice for all and accepting domination by strength. So it would be for the rest of the 20th century, and America forever tainted by global fascism. So that's the first part. I think I'm going to go ahead and leave things on the first break. I'll get to the next part in the next video. We'll do this part by part. But let's take a look at some of this content. Any good comments? Holy shit, content up to 1977. People are freaking out that TNO2 is actually real. Go figure. Absolute Cinema, TNO2 confirmed. TNO2 comes out before Penelope's Web. Yep. Something big is happening. So, one thing that the rework is bringing about, Hawaii and the treaty ports out of California are starting as American at the start of the game. Now, this is going to be a pretty big change because, as we all know, in TNO, at the start of the game currently, since the start of the game, the treaty ports have been occupied by the Japanese, and Hawaii has been occupied by the Japanese. So that's a pretty big lore change. I don't personally feel one way or the other about it. I'll be honest. It is what it is. it seems to make sense with the way they're doing it. Japan was always going to be more easily occupiable or easily defeatable than the Germans. The big premise for Thousand Week Reich, after all, is Germany wins in Europe, or at least forces a stalemate, but the Americans just push through and occupy Japan. So Japan is beatable pretty easily. So a total Japanese victory in the Pacific, or even forcing a Japanese victory at all, is going to be more of a stretch. So I find this to be a bit more realistic. Not that realism necessarily matters. In my Nazi victory mod. But I don't know. I see this change as making sense. And I think if Japan occupied Japan, or Hawaii to begin with, we probably wouldn't get Hawaii back to begin with. So I think this makes a lot of sense in that context as a change. So I'm okay with that. I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna leave things here for now before we take a look at the next part. There's gonna be some interesting stuff coming up with the rest of the lore. So what brings us up? This gets us to the end of the war and the peace treaty. What's gonna happen next with the events from the end of the war to the start of the game? We'll find out then. Until then, thanks for watching, my friends. My name is Mr. Dogbot333. If you want to read this on your own time, I'll provide a link down in the description box below. I have a bunch of other links down there if you want to check those out. And yeah, if you guys want to check those out, go ahead. Like if you liked, dislike if you didn't. If you want to see more of this stuff in the future, go ahead and leave comments. It's a little bit of a divergence from what I usually do, but if you find that interesting, if you want stuff like do more historical tangents, do less historical tangents, more low taper fade memes, less low taper fade memes, go ahead and let me know what you guys want. I'm open to anything. I do want to make these interesting and captivating as much as I can. So if you guys can help me do that, please let me know. I'm gonna go ahead and leave things there. Though, thanks for watching, my friends. My name has been Mr. Dogbot333, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye now.